The summer of 1851 arrived with a heavy, suffocating heat that seemed to press upon every living thing in the Low Country, settling like a weight on the sprawling fields of the Middleton estate. The great house, a two-story structure of whitewashed timber with wide porches, stood in silent grandeur among towering oaks and pines. From a distance it was the picture of order and prosperity, a household where wealth and civility appeared absolute. But beneath the pristine facade, whispers slumbered in darkened corridors and behind closed doors, whispers that, if revealed, could shatter the lives of all who dwelled there. Clara had grown up within these walls as one of the household's most trusted servants. Assigned from early childhood to the care of linens, silver and fine clothing, she moved silently through the rooms, her hands trained to fold, to polish, to prepare and to clean. Her small frame and soft-spoken ways allowed her to witness the estate's secrets without drawing notice, to observe without being seen. Over the years, Clara had watched the cycles of life and death in the Middleton household, the births of children, the illnesses that came with summer heat, the quiet despair of servants and masters alike. She understood that there was a rhythm to the estate, a pulse beneath the surface of polite conversation, and she had learned to navigate it with caution and discretion. It was during one sweltering July afternoon that Mr. Edward Middleton first noticed Clara in a way he had never noticed a servant before. He had returned from Charleston, where he had attended a week of business meetings, and now walked the wide hallways of the main house with the slow deliberation of a man unused to domestic life. Clara, polishing the brass handles of the parlor doors, looked up at him, and for a moment the air between them thickened, charged with an awareness that neither fully understood. Edward was the only son of the Middleton line, the heir to generations of wealth built upon rice and indigo, upon the labor of people like Clara. His father, a stern man of rigid morals, had died the previous year, leaving Edward to inherit both the estate and its burden. Edward had been trained to command, to control, to govern, not merely lands and slaves, but the very rhythms of life upon which the estate depended. Yet in that moment, in the quiet presence of Clara, he felt something that had no name, something dangerous, unspoken, and forbidden. For her part, Clara felt it too. She had seen Edward grow from a boy into a man, watched his transformations with the careful attentiveness of someone who knew the boundaries she was sworn to observe. But now, standing beneath the heat of the southern sun, she felt a stirring of fear and desire in equal measure. She did not speak, did not move, but felt herself trembling slightly as Edward's gaze lingered upon her. Their interactions began with small fleeting moments, a brush of the hand as he accepted a folded garment, a glance that lingered too long during meals, a quiet question about the state of the house whispered in a tone that seemed to hover between command and curiosity. Each encounter was a test, a negotiation of boundaries, though neither could fully articulate what drew them to one another. Over the months that followed, Edward and Clara grew closer in ways that could not be spoken aloud. They met in the shadows of the servants' stairwell, exchanged notes hidden in the folds of laundry, and lingered in quiet rooms under the pretense of household duty. Their relationship, at first tentative and cautious, grew bolder with time, as though the heat of the southern summer had inflamed desires that could no longer be contained. Yet all the while a shadow hung over their connection, a shadow that neither could name, a whisper of truth that had been buried so long that even the memory of it seemed distant. Clara's own lineage had been a secret kept for decades. She had been told as a child that her mother had been sold away to another plantation, that her father was unknown, and that her existence should be one of servitude and obedience. But even in her earliest memories there were hints that her story was not as simple as she had been told. She carried a subtle resemblance to the Middleton family, a line of delicate features and dark eyes that seemed out of place among the servants of the estate. These features, she thought, were nothing more than a cruel coincidence, a whisper of vanity or imagination, but in the hidden corners of the estate, certain old servants had long murmured about connections that were not meant to be spoken aloud. One evening, as the cicadas sang their relentless song through the trees, Edward led Clara into the upper west wing of the house, a part of the estate long abandoned after the death of his father. Dust coated the floors and cobwebs stretched across the corners, but the air was quiet, untouched by the daily chaos of the plantation. There, in that silent room, Edward confessed what he could not speak aloud anywhere else: his love for her, his longing that had grown unbearable. Clara listened, her hands clasped tightly before her, heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to speak, to deny, to flee, but the words caught in her throat. In the soft light of the fading day, Edward's eyes reflected both longing and torment, and in that moment, she realized that she could not resist him, nor did she wish to. And so began the forbidden love that would shape the tragic destiny of them both. Their encounters grew more intimate, more daring, conducted in hidden corners of the estate, or in the shadows of the surrounding woods. Each kiss, each whispered confession, carried with it the weight of unspoken rules and impossible moral dilemma. The servants watched from a distance, noticing stolen glances and sudden silences, but no one dared to speak of what they suspected. To do so would be to invite ruin upon them. Yet even as desire blossomed between Edward and Clara, the past lurked like a predator in the corners of the estate. Mammy Judith, the oldest servant on the property, watched them with quiet apprehension. She had served the Middleton family for decades, had witnessed generations rise and fall, and understood the patterns of love, betrayal and ruin better than anyone. She saw the resemblance between Clara and the Middleton bloodline, and her heart ached with knowledge she could not share. She knew the danger that awaited should the truth come to light, yet she could do nothing to prevent what was already set in motion. The turning point came one late August afternoon, as a storm rolled over the low country, darkening the sky and turning the air heavy with the scent of rain. Edward had taken Clara to the old family chapel, long disused and overgrown with ivy. The walls, once whitewashed, were now streaked with time and neglect, and the wooden pews creaked underfoot. It was there, amidst the shadows and the scent of damp wood, that Clara revealed to Edward a secret she had only recently discovered. Her father was in fact a distant cousin of the Middletons. The blood that ran in her veins was entwined with his own. Edward recoiled, the confession striking him like a physical blow. The realization of their connection, of what they had already done in secret, sent his mind reeling. He felt revulsion, horror, and a peculiar twisting guilt that gnawed at his very soul. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she tried to explain that she had only learned the truth recently, and that she had never known the full extent of her lineage. But Edward could not hear her. All he could see was the shadow of their forbidden intimacy, the implications of their love, and the children that might yet come from it. For days afterward, the house was filled with tension so thick it was almost tangible. Edward wandered the estate in a state of agitation, speaking little and sleeping less. He sought counsel in books of law, medicine, and theology, desperate for answers that could justify or explain the unthinkable. Clara, meanwhile, became withdrawn, her bright spirit dimmed by the weight of the revelation and the shame it imposed. The secret, once a source of passion and connection, had become a curse that threatened to destroy them both. It was Mammy Judith who first realized that the situation was approaching its inevitable conclusion. She watched Edward pacing in the moonlight, observed Clara at the window with vacant eyes, and felt the tremor of fear in her own heart. She had long known that the estate's secrets had a way of consuming those who dared to uncover them. She tried to intervene, to counsel restraint, but her words fell on ears too distracted by desire and guilt to listen. By early September, the first signs of pregnancy appeared. Clara's body changed in subtle, terrifying ways, and Edward's horror grew daily. They spoke little, communicating only in fleeting glances and trembling hands. The knowledge of the child, their child, loomed over them like a storm cloud, threatening to break with a force that could destroy them all. They tried to conceal their growing fear from the other servants, from the overseers, from the world itself, but nothing could contain the tension. The estate seemed to respond to the dread in the air. Horses shied in the fields, livestock refused to eat, and even the old oaks seemed to groan under the weight of invisible pressure. It was as though the land itself knew the nature of the sin being born within its wall. Mammy Judith watched silently, praying to whatever gods might hear her. She knew the consequences of revelation, yet feared the consequences of silence more. Something terrible was approaching, she thought, something that would not leave a soul unscathed. And as September faded into the oppressive heat of October, it became clear that nothing could stop the inevitable. The love that had once seemed a private rebellion, a secret sanctuary, had become a ticking time bomb, a weight of moral and social impossibility. The estate, which had always been a place of structured routine and quiet appearances, had transformed into a house of suspense, anticipation, and unspoken terror. And within its walls, Edward and Clara faced a truth they could neither escape nor deny, that love, when forbidden by the very blood that connected them, could only lead to despair. October bled into November with a chill that carried more than the promise of winter. The air around the Middleton estate was dense and heavy, suffused with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Even the servants felt it, though they could not name it, an unease that settled over the estate like a living thing, pressing down on every room and corridor. Clara, once the embodiment of composure, had begun to unravel. Her hands shook as she carried water to the house, her back bent under invisible weight, and her eyes carried a haunted look, as if she were constantly seeing things no one else could. She whispered constantly to herself, repeating prayers she barely understood, hoping the words might stave off the horrors she anticipated. She had begun to fear the child growing inside her, seeing in it not a promise, but a Edward, meanwhile, had descended into a torment that was equal parts obsession and despair. The revelation of their blood connection had left him incapable of reason. He spent hours pacing the long hallways of the estate, muttering scripture about sin and punishment, attempting to reconcile the depth of his love with the unnatural bonds of kinship. Every glance at Clara now carried the weight of horror and desire intertwined. He longed to touch her, yet recoiled in revulsion the instant he did. Their shared moments, once a sanctuary, had become a minefield, each word, each touch, laden with guilt. Mammy Judith watched them both, her heart heavy with foreknowledge. She had seen similar tragedies unfold across generations of plantations, families destroyed by secrets too terrible to speak aloud. She knew the moment had come when her silence could no longer protect the innocent, yet she also knew that intervention could only postpone the inevitable. The estate itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, as though every floorboard, every timber, was aware of the doom approaching. By mid-November, Clara's pregnancy had become unmistakable. The lines of her body shifted, the fullness of her abdomen marking her condition. Edward could no longer hide his panic. He avoided her gaze when possible, but when they were together, the tension became unbearable. One evening, as the sun sank behind the tall pines casting long shadows over the house, Edward confronted Clara in the abandoned chapel. "Clara," he said, his voice trembling despite his attempt at calm, "we cannot continue as we have. You carry my blood and yours in ways I cannot accept. We are doomed to repeat what has already destroyed us in secret. Do you not see what this child is? What it will?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. She had felt the same fear, the same dread, but had hoped that perhaps the child might be spared the curse that seemed to cling to their family like a disease. "Edward," she whispered, her voice cracking, "it is not yet born. Perhaps it will be healthy, perhaps." He shook his head violently. "You do not understand. The blood, the sins of the past, they do not allow for hope. This child is a reminder of everything forbidden, everything we are not allowed to touch. I cannot bear it. I cannot." His words ended in a strangled sob, echoing off the cracked walls of the chapel. Clara reached out, her hand trembling, to touch his shoulder. "We are already human, Edward. We are already broken. What can we do but endure what comes?" Endure. The word hung between them, hollow and cruel. It was not comfort. It was a sentence. The following weeks were a study in despair. Edward became increasingly obsessed with tracking Clara's every movement, her every meal, her every word. He pored over medical texts he could barely comprehend, desperate to find some explanation or remedy for what he feared would inevitably be a malformed child. He wrote feverishly in a leather-bound journal, recording every detail of Clara's condition, his own emotional deterioration, and his twisted attempts at moral justification. Each page bore the hallmarks of a mind unraveling, scrawled annotations, passages underlined repeatedly, scripture quoted with the obsessive repetition of someone seeking divine absolution.
Clara, meanwhile, sank deeper into a fragile mental state. She spent hours preparing garments for the unborn child, small linens folded with meticulous care, tiny blankets embroidered with delicate patterns. She hummed lullabies she did not know, as if the child's soul could hear her and be spared its fate. Sometimes in the quiet moments of twilight, she would press her hands to her swollen belly and whisper apologies to the child, pleading for it to forgive them for what they could not prevent. The estate's atmosphere became oppressive. The servants whispered among themselves, afraid to enter certain rooms where the tension between master and servant, or rather master and secret kin, was almost tangible. Windows remained shuttered, doors creaked under their own weight, and strange sounds, footsteps when no one was present, sighs of wind that carried too human a cadence, haunted the main hallways. One evening during a particularly violent thunderstorm, Edward discovered evidence that pushed him further toward madness. Clara, in her own fragile state, had sought out the assistance of an older slave woman known for knowledge of herbs and remedies. She had attempted to alleviate her fears, to ensure that if the child were to come into the world, it would not carry the curse she believed would inevitably follow. Edward found remnants of poultices, herbal mixtures, and crumpled leaves hidden among Clara's belongings. The discovery tipped him into frenzy. "You would hide this from me," he screamed, his voice carrying over the roar of the storm. "You would attempt to meddle with the fate we are already bound to." Clara recoiled, I only wanted to protect what might be innocent. Please, Edward, do not curse me further." His eyes, wide with despair, seemed to see not Clara but the embodiment of sin itself. "Innocent? Nothing here is innocent. Our blood, our love, it is all tainted. Everything we touch is cursed." The argument escalated into a storm that rivaled the one outside. Furniture was overturned, doors slammed, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the fury of their confrontation. Mammy Judith, hearing the commotion, rushed toward the chapel, but even her presence could not immediately calm them. Edward's mind had begun to fracture completely. The child growing in Clara's womb had become not just a source of fear, but a symbol of all the forbidden acts that had defined their secret relationship. By late November, the tension reached its climax. Clara's condition worsened, her body weakened by constant fear and the stress imposed by Edward's obsessive monitoring. Edward himself became pale and gaunt, speaking constantly of penance, divine punishment, and the inevitability of suffering. He spoke to no one but Clara, and at times to Mammy Judith, reciting scripture and muttering about sins inherited and repeated. It was on a cold, moonless night that the final confrontation occurred. Edward found Clara in the nursery, arranging the tiny garments for the child she feared yet hoped for. The sight, innocent in its domesticity, was enough to push Edward past reason. "No more," he shouted, voice echoing through the empty hallways. "We cannot continue like this. The child, it must not exist. We are forbidden. I am forbidden. You are forbidden." Clara turned to him, her hands trembling as she held a tiny blanket. "Edward, please, the child is already here in my body. We cannot undo what is done. We must survive. We must endure." But Edward could not hear reason. Madness had overtaken him, and in his mind survival meant eradicating the evidence of their transgression. The scene that followed was brief and terrible, a violent culmination of obsession, fear, and inherited sin. Mammy Judith, arriving too late, found only the aftermath, a tableau of grief, blood, and finality that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The dawn revealed the estate's new reality: silence, where once there had been life, and the oppressive weight of a secret that could never again be spoken aloud. The house, which had once represented wealth, order, and civility, now stood as a monument to a tragedy born of blood, desire, and secrecy. The servants whispered among themselves, mourning and terrified, while Mammy Judith tended to what little remained of her charges, swearing never to speak of what had occurred. The Middleton estate, once proud and alive with the rhythm of generations, had become a place of shadow and memory. Its halls echoed with the remnants of forbidden love, the cries of what might have been, and the lessons of secrets too terrible to reveal. And in the surrounding fields and forests, the wind seemed to carry the sighs of those lost, a mournful chorus for a tragedy that had consumed everything in its path. The Middleton estate never recovered from that November night. The once proud house stood as a hollow shell, its windows dark and lifeless, the air thick with the lingering residue of despair. The servants, traumatized by what they had witnessed, quietly abandoned the property one by one, seeking refuge in neighboring plantations or towns. Mammy Judith remained, bound by duty, memory, and a secret she could carry alone. She moved silently through the halls, whispering prayers over the empty rooms, murmuring apologies to the souls she could not save. For years, the estate remained untouched. Nature began reclaiming the land. Ivy crawled along the cracked walls, and moss covered the stone foundations. The surrounding forest crept closer each season, its branches brushing against the windows like accusatory fingers. Hunters and travelers occasionally passed the estate, reporting strange sensations, a sudden chill in the air, faint cries echoing through the trees, and shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun. Local folklore quickly labeled the place the Middleton Curse, a name spoken with both awe and fear. Mammy Judith's health gradually declined. Each night she relived the horrors of that fateful night, replaying Edward's anguished cries and Clara's panicked sobs. She would often sit in the ruined nursery, caressing the tiny garments that Clara had meticulously prepared for the child that never had the chance to live. She whispered promises of forgiveness, both for herself and for the family she had served faithfully, though she knew some sins were beyond absolution. When she finally passed in 1854, she took the last secrets of the Middleton estate with her, her tomb unmarked, her existence acknowledged only in the memories of a few who had once worked the land. Decades passed, and the property changed hands several times. No family managed to hold the estate for long. Strange occurrences, phantoms glimpsed in the corridors, furniture mysteriously overturned, and unexplainable sounds echoing through the halls drove away those who sought to live there. The whispers of a haunted house spread throughout the county, keeping potential buyers away and allowing the shadow of the past to linger undisturbed. By the late 19th century, the estate had become little more than a ruin. Windows gaped like empty eyes and the roof sagged under the weight of decay. Trees burst through the floorboards in some rooms, and the walls were blackened with soot and age. Yet even in ruin, the air retained a weighty presence, as if the house itself remembered the sins and passions that had occurred within its walls. Locals avoided it after sunset, and children dared each other to approach the main hall, only to run screaming after the first touch of the wind that carried whispers of guilt and grief. In 1889, a fire consumed the central portion of the house. The flames began in the nursery, the room where Edward and Clara had met their tragic end. It is said the fire was mysterious in origin. No lightning struck, no stove had been left unattended. The fire burned with an intensity that seemed unnatural, devouring timber and stone alike. By dawn, only smoking ruins remained, scattered across the property like the remnants of broken lives. The cemetery where Clara's first child had been buried was overtaken by weeds and forgotten. Any trace of the family's existence, save for the charred remains of the estate, slowly disappeared beneath the creeping vegetation. Yet the estate refused to fade completely from memory. Hunters passing through the remaining fields often reported sudden drops in temperature, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and the sensation of unseen eyes following them. Some claimed to see shadowy figures in the ruins, fleeting glimpses of Edward pacing the halls, or Clara kneeling in the garden, murmuring prayers for forgiveness. Even in death, it seemed, the estate's horrors were not satisfied. The story of the Middleton estate came to serve as a cautionary tale in the surrounding region. Parents told it to children to warn against the dangers of forbidden desires, family secrets, and the weight of sins left unconfessed. Travelers who asked about the estate were met with silence or ominous glances, the tale passed down with every retelling growing darker and more tragic. The mansion itself became synonymous with inevitability, the idea that once certain acts are committed, the consequences are unavoidable, echoing across generations. The moral decay that began with the union of Edward and Clara continued to haunt the land long after the bodies had rotted and the estate had burned. Locals swore that the ground itself was cursed, that crops refused to grow where the house had once stood, and that livestock avoided the field. Even the river that ran near the estate seemed tainted, its waters colder and slower, reflecting a grayness in the sky that never fully lifted. In time, the ruins were overtaken by vines and trees. The stone foundations were the only reminders of the home where passion, guilt, and secrecy had converged with fatal precision. Travelers sometimes stumbled upon the estate, guided by curiosity or misfortune, only to flee in terror, after hearing what they described as crying, laughter, or whispered names that carried the weight of generations. Through it all, the true story of Edward and Clara, the full horror of their kinship, their love, the cursed child, and the violent end, remained largely unknown. Few records survived, and the local authorities who had investigated the deaths in 1846 buried the facts under euphemisms of madness and misfortune. The truth existed only in fragments, in whispered confessions, in the scattered remnants of journals and letters, and in the memory of those few who had lived through the events like Mammy Judy. The Middleton estate, now fully abandoned, stands as a silent monument to the consequences of forbidden acts and concealed sins. Its story, passed down in fragments, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, the dangers of secrets, the destructive power of desire, and the inevitability of consequences when morality is twisted by obsession and guilt. It is a reminder that not all truths are meant to be known, and not all sins can be forgiven. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is the understanding that the fates of Edward and Clara, and the ruin of the estate, were set in motion long before their birth. The weight of their bloodline, the abuses of their ancestors, and the unspoken horrors of the past created a destiny they could not escape. The estate itself, through its ruin, whispers a warning across time. Some sins, once committed, echo endlessly, and the consequences reverberate through the generations with a persistence that is impossible to silence. Today, the land that once held the Middleton estate is thick with undergrowth. Hunters occasionally report the same chilling sensations noted by travelers in decades past: inexplicable cold, fleeting shadows, and whispers that vanish when one tries to locate their source. The local folklore continues to describe the estate as cursed, haunted by the sins of Edward and Clara, by the child that never lived, and by a love that was both natural and forbidden. The ruins remind us that human actions, when tainted by secrecy and transgression, can leave marks far beyond their immediate time. They warn of the fragility of morality, the danger of uncovering forbidden truths, and the inexorable consequences of passions that defy reason and law. The Middleton estate remains, even in decay, as a testament to a darkness that was never entirely extinguished, a darkness born of love, guilt, blood, and the inexorable weight of ancestral sin. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Middleton estate had faded almost entirely into the wilderness. Trees and vines claimed what remained of the stone foundations, and the river that once reflected the grandeur of the mansion now wound silently through the undergrowth, murky and uninviting. Few dared to venture near the ruins, and those who did often returned pale, muttering of chills and whispers that seemed to follow them through the woods. Local historians recorded the estate only briefly, focusing on architectural details rather than the horrific family history. The tale of Edward and Clara, and the cursed lineage they had perpetuated, existed mainly in oral tradition, half forgotten, distorted by time, and tinged with the superstitions of rural South Carolina. Stories persisted of a mother's sorrow, a son's guilt, and a daughter's innocence destroyed before her time. The truth of the incestuous relationship, the deformed child, and the violent deaths was buried in the collective memory, surviving only in hints and shadows. Generations later, occasional explorers found remnants of the estate, charred beams, fragments of shattered furniture, and the tiny embroidered garments Clara had prepared for her lost child. These items, scattered and decayed, bore silent witness to the tragedies that had unfolded. Some claimed that when the wind blew through the ruins, it carried the faint cries of the children who had never lived, their voices entwined with Clara's prayers and Edward's anguish. The land itself seemed to reject attempts at habitation. Each family that tried to rebuild or repurpose the property eventually left, citing strange occurrences, doors that slammed without cause, distant screams in the night, and shadows moving across rooms where no one stood. Even the most rational observers admitted a lingering, inexplicable sense of dread. The estate's reputation as cursed grew with every abandoned attempt at settlement, cementing its place in local folklore as a place where tragedy had been etched into the very soil. Yet, despite decades of silence, the story of the Middleton estate carried a cautionary weight. Scholars of human behavior and local historians noted that the estate exemplified the destructive consequences of secrets, lies, and forbidden desires. The sins of one generation, when left unresolved or concealed, could echo across decades, shaping the fates of descendants in ways impossible to predict or control. The narrative also became a meditation on morality and responsibility. Estella's choice to reveal the truth, though motivated by honesty and maternal concern, had triggered a chain of events that destroyed every life it touched. Edward and Clara, caught between love and forbidden instinct, suffered unbearable guilt and torment. Even Mammy Judith, who had sought to guide and protect, could not prevent the devastation. The story underscored the dangers inherent in actions taken without fully understanding the consequences, and the heavy burden of knowledge that can both enlighten and destroy.
Modern visitors to the region often report a lingering unease near the ruins. Some claim to hear soft singing in the wind, the ghostly echo of lullabies once sung to children who never had a chance to live. Others see figures moving between the trees, fleeting glimpses of a man and a woman who do not belong to this time. Occasionally small items, buttons, pieces of cloth, or broken glass are discovered in the undergrowth, hinting at lives that ended in catastrophe and confirming that the past, though buried, never fully disappears. Today the property remains largely untouched, a forested expanse dotted with stone remnants of a once grand mansion. The cemeteries, long overgrown, hide the graves of the deformed child, Clara and Edward. No headstones mark their resting places. Anonymity in death mirrors the erasure they suffered in life. Their story persists only in the fragments of memory, the whispered legends of locals, and the occasional historical footnote that acknowledges tragedy without delving into its darkest truths. The legacy of the Middleton estate endures as a somber reminder. Human actions, particularly those hidden behind secrecy or taboo, have consequences that transcend generations. Forbidden love, when entwined with deception and unacknowledged kinship, produces suffering that cannot be undone. Even well-intentioned truths, when revealed without consideration for timing and readiness, may devastate rather than liberate. The estate itself, through ruin and haunting, embodies these lessons, standing as a monument to grief, guilt, and the inexorable weight of human folly. In the end, the tragedy of Edward and Clara is a meditation on the fragile boundary between morality and destruction. It confronts us with questions of justice, the inheritance of sin, and the limits of forgiveness. Some secrets once uncovered cannot be contained. Some sins echo through time, shaping the destiny of those yet unborn. The Middleton estate,
with its overgrown ruins and whispered legends, reminds us that certain stories are too heavy to be fully grasped, and certain truths too dangerous to bear. Perhaps the final lesson of the estate is one of humility. To understand the full ramifications of human behavior, especially when it involves desire, deception, and forbidden acts, requires more than curiosity or moral judgment. It requires recognition of the delicate threads that bind life, family, and society. Edward and Clara, trapped by circumstance and blood, suffered the ultimate consequence for the transgressions that began long before they were born. Their tale is one of inevitability, illustrating how hidden sins once set in motion cascade across generations, leaving devastation in their wake. The ruins remain, silent yet eloquent, warning all who pass. Some sins are too great to forgive, some truths too heavy to reveal, and some consequences too profound to escape. The story of Edward and Clara, their children, and the cursed estate serves as both a historical record and a moral lesson, a reminder that the past shapes the present, and that the shadows of human actions can linger far longer than life itself. In the quiet of the forest, the wind through the trees carries fragments of a song, a prayer, a whisper, the voices of those whose lives were destroyed by desire, secrecy, and blood. And though the estate may crumble and the world move on, the echoes of Edward and Clara's tragedy will endure, a perpetual testament to the dangers of forbidden love, family secrets, and the inescapable weight of inherited sin. Decades after the tragedy, the Lambert plantation became little more than a whispered legend. Its story spread through neighboring towns, growing with each retelling, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes understated, but always carrying the weight of horror. Children were warned not to stray into the woods surrounding the ruins, and local farmers avoided the fields where the main house had once stood. The whispers spoke not just of ghosts, but of a curse born from sins that had never been confessed or reconciled. Scholars who visited in the early 20th century noted the unusual preservation of certain ruins, fragments of the mansion, stone foundations, and the skeletal remains of gardens meticulously planned but abandoned for generations. These remnants served as physical testimony to the life and death of the family that once inhabited the property. Despite their ruin, the structures seemed almost intentional in their decay, as if the land itself were rejecting the presence of humanity after witnessing acts that transgressed nature and morality. Stories persisted that the spirits of Edward, Clara, and their children were not at rest. Travelers reported glimpses of figures in the windows of the ruined mansion, faint cries in the wind, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Some locals swore that the baby clothes Clara had sewn could still be found in the woods, inexplicably fresh, fluttering as if tended by invisible hands. The plantation became synonymous with tragedy, a place where curiosity and innocence collided with the weight of sin and secrecy. Even as the property changed hands repeatedly, the pattern continued. New owners reported equipment disappearing, tools left in one place and found in another, and doors swinging open in empty rooms. Animals brought to the estate refused to remain, and workers often claimed the sensation of unseen eyes tracking their movement. Each family that attempted to settle the land eventually fled, reinforcing the perception of a curse that extended far beyond the human tragedies that had originally occurred. Historians and psychologists later studied the Lambert case as a cautionary example of human obsession, inherited trauma, and the consequences of undisclosed secrets. The events demonstrated the destructive force of taboo desires, the fragility of the human psyche under pressure, and the ethical dilemmas surrounding truth and disclosure. Estella's decision to reveal the secret, though morally complex, illustrated the devastating consequences that can arise from choices made with incomplete understanding of human emotion and capacity. Yet the story also contained lessons about endurance and memory. Though the family was gone, the plantation's ruins and the surrounding landscape preserved their tale. Through local lore, oral histories, and occasional artifacts discovered in the woods, the tragedies of Edward, Clara, and their children were kept alive, serving as a grim reminder that actions, once taken, echo indefinite. The plantation itself became a symbol of the inescapable consequences of hidden sins and forbidden acts. The surviving memories of the Lambert family also highlighted the human need to assign meaning to tragedy. Ghost stories, whispers of spirits, and mysterious occurrences were ways for successive generations to process events that had been both shocking and morally incomprehensible. In some sense, the haunting of the estate was less about supernatural phenomena, and more about the psychological imprint left by human actions, a lingering resonance of grief, guilt, and taboo that the land absorbed. By the mid-20th century, only a few stone foundations and scattered fragments of the estate remained, overrun by vines and moss. Amateur historians occasionally visited, attempting to map the ruins and document the grave sites, but the full scope of the tragedy remained elusive. The slave cemetery where Clara and her deformed child were buried was largely reclaimed by the forest. Headstones, if they had ever existed, were long gone, and the names of the dead were erased from formal record. Only Mammy Eliza's memory preserved the full story, though she had taken the most damning details to her grave in contemporary times. Paranormal investigators and curious travelers continue to report eerie sensations when visiting the property. Cold spots, whispers, and fleeting shadows are cited as evidence of lingering spirits, though skeptics argue they are products of imagination influenced by the plantation's infamous reputation. Regardless of interpretation, the estate's legacy remains intact, a cautionary tale of secrecy, forbidden love, and the inexorable weight of human action across generations. The Lambert Plantation, now fully abandoned, stands as a monument to tragedy. Its ruins, overtaken by the South Carolina wilderness, symbolize the fragility of human endeavors when corrupted by hidden sin. The story of Edward and Clara, their doomed children, and the secrets that Mammy Eliza held, reflects the destructive consequences of actions rooted in deception, desire, and denial. Ultimately, the tale poses difficult questions that resonate beyond the historical context. What is the moral responsibility of those who know devastating truths? Can suffering ever be justified in the name of honesty or redemption? And to what extent are the innocent punished by the sins of their ancestors? The Lambert estate offers no answers, only the enduring silence of ruined walls, overgrown cemeteries, and the whispered memories of those lost to history. Though the people who lived and died on the plantation are gone, the legacy of their actions continues to haunt the land and the collective memory of the region. The story of Edward, Clara, and their children serves as a timeless reminder that some truths are too heavy to reveal, some sins too profound to forgive, and some tragedies too deep to escape. The echoes of their lives linger in every stone, every shadow, and every whisper that drifts through the overgrown ruins of the Lambert Plantation, a permanent testament to the consequences of secrets, forbidden desires, and the inexorable passage of time. By the late 19th century, the Lambert Plantation had become a symbol in local lore, a cautionary tale whispered around firesides and in church pews. Travelers told of a place where misfortune clung to the land like ivy, where even the sun seemed reluctant to shine fully on the ruin. Despite the passage of decades, the story of Craig, Lena, and their ill-fated children endured, not as history recorded in books, but as memory preserved in fear, rumor, and superstition. Occasionally, descendants of nearby families ventured close to the estate, curious about its dark reputation. Some reported hearing faint cries carried on the wind, the laughter of children in empty rooms, or the sudden sensation of being watched. Others found objects like tiny, elaborately embroidered baby clothes lying in the overgrowth, inexplicably clean despite years of exposure to the element. The local population came to view the plantation not simply as abandoned property, but as a cursed space, a monument to tragedy that refused to rest in peace. Mammy Eliza's presence lingered long after her death. Though she had taken the Lambert secrets to her grave, the knowledge of what she had witnessed had indelibly shaped her actions and her silent. Oral histories describe her as a figure who seemed haunted even in life, murmuring prayers for the souls of the dead and speaking to shadows as if they were old friends. Her legacy was one of careful observation, moral restraint, and a profound understanding of the dangers that buried truths can carry. The new owners who attempted to inhabit the estate, merchants, bankers, and farmers, faced inexplicable misfortune. Tools disappeared, or were found in places where no one could have moved them. Fires ignited spontaneously in abandoned rooms. Livestock refused to enter the pastures, and workers complained of unnerving whispers in empty hallways. Some families abandoned the property within months. Others managed only a few years before selling at a significant loss. Each failed attempt reinforced the idea that the Lambert Plantation was cursed, a site where history and memory had conspired to preserve the weight of guilt and sorrow. Historians examining the tragedy often pointed to the psychological dimensions of the Lambert story. Craig's obsession with truth and redemption, Lena's fragile mental state, and Estella's tragic decisions illustrate the devastating consequences of human secrecy, moral ambiguity, and the relentless pressure of social and familial expectation. The events on the plantation were not merely personal misfortunes. They were manifestations of systemic oppression, patriarchal power, and the destructive dynamics of slavery that created circumstances in which love, desire, and morality became hopelessly entangled. The plantation's ruins, slowly reclaimed by the South Carolina wilderness, became an inadvertent memorial. Stone foundations crumbled beneath vines, and once orderly gardens were overtaken by bramble. The slave cemetery, where Lena and her first child had been buried, disappeared beneath the forest floor, leaving only faint impressions of grave. Yet even in decay, the site communicated the weight of history, a tangible reminder of the lives destroyed, the secrets that poisoned families, and the enduring scars left by human cruelty. By the early 20th century, the Lambert story had entered regional folklore. Tales of hauntings, spectral figures, and sudden gusts of icy wind were shared across generations. Parents used the story to teach lessons about morality and obedience, while local historians debated the accuracy of the account. Yet the essence of the tragedy remained, a stark illustration of how secrecy, abuse, and transgression could ripple across generations, leaving behind ruin, grief, and persistent fear. The moral of the Lambert tragedy extended beyond its immediate horrors. It posed difficult questions about responsibility, justice, and the consequences of uncovering or concealing the truth. Estella's decision to reveal the secret, though intended to bring clarity, unleashed a chain of events that no one could control. Craig's obsessive quest for redemption, and Lena's desperate attempts to prevent further suffering, were human reactions to impossible circumstances, yet they culminated in the ultimate devastation. The story suggested that some truths, no matter how well-intentioned, may be too destructive to bear. Even today, the Lambert Plantation stands as a testament to these lessons. While only ruins remain, the land itself seems charged with memory, a silent witness to the horrors that occurred. Scholars and amateur historians occasionally visit the site, sifting through the remnants for artifacts or evidence, but most leave with an unsettling awareness that the land remembered. Local hunters and hikers report inexplicable sensations, sudden chills, glimpses of figures at the periphery of vision, and whispers carried by the wind. Though these experiences cannot be verified, they continue to perpetuate the legend of the Lambert curse. Ultimately, the Lambert Plantation forces reflection on the complexities of human behavior and morality. The story asks whether knowledge is always power, or whether some truths carry consequences so dire that ignorance might be safe. It challenges us to consider how the sins of one generation can impact those that follow, and how social structures, secrecy, and abuse intersect to create circumstances where tragedy becomes inevitable. The ghosts of Craig, Lena, and their children linger, not merely as supernatural entities, but as enduring symbols of human fragility, guilt, and the cost of forbidden knowledge. In the silence of the overgrown fields, the ruins, and the forgotten cemeteries, the Lambert Plantation remains a monument to tragedy. Its story serves as a somber reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, can echo through time, shaping memory, morality, and the landscape itself. The estate, now a shadow of its former grandeur, invites reflection on the enduring consequences of secrecy, the fragility of familial bonds, and the inescapable weight of human choice. Even if the physical structures have vanished or decayed beyond recognition, the Lambert story endures, etched into memory, whispered in local lore, and carried forward as a cautionary tale. The plantation reminds us that some tragedies cannot be undone, some sins cannot be forgiven, and some truths, once revealed, carry consequences that stretch far beyond those who first committed them. The Lambert Plantation's ruins, silent and overgrown, are now less a home than a warning that human actions, especially those shrouded in secrecy and compounded by moral compromise, can leave legacies that outlive us, echoing through generations with an eerie persistence. The echoes of Craig, Lena, Estella, and Mammy Eliza linger still, challenging each who walks the land to remember, reflect, and reckon with the past.
As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Lambert Plantation became less a home than a story, a cautionary tale whispered across the region. Travelers, hunters, and curious locals spoke of ruins where shadows seemed to linger, where cold winds carried faint murmurs, and where the earth itself seemed unwilling to forget. The plantation, though abandoned, remained alive in the collective imagination, a place where tragedy and secrecy intertwined to create a haunting legacy. The land's history became a moral and psychological lesson. Scholars, folklorists, and local storytellers debated the details of Craig and Lena's doomed relationship, Estella's fateful choice, and Mammy Eliza's silent burden. Some focused on the human consequences, the ways guilt, secrecy, and social norms collided to produce suffering. Others emphasized the supernatural overtones, claiming that the spirits of the Lambert family still wandered the grounds, warning intruders of the cost of hidden truths. Mammy Eliza, though long gone, was remembered as a figure of both wisdom and sorrow. Her life exemplified the complexity of moral responsibility under extreme circumstances.
She had sought to protect the family she served, yet the revelation she delivered had triggered a catastrophe. Her story, passed down through oral histories, underscored the painful truth that even well-intentioned actions can have unforeseen and devastating consequences. By the early 20th century, successive owners of the property faced misfortune. Crops failed inexplicably, tools disappeared, and workers refused to stay overnight. Many attributed these events to the land's cursed nature, and the plantation changed hands repeatedly, each new owner unable to establish permanence. By the time of the 1889 fire that partially destroyed the main house, the Lambert estate had already gained a reputation as a place where human tragedy lingered beyond death. The fire, originating in the room where Craig and Lena had perished, seemed almost symbolic, consuming the physical remains while leaving the moral and emotional scars intact. Despite the ruins, the story of the Lambert family endured in local consciousness. The deaths of Craig and Lena, the abortion of their second child, and Estella's final months became cautionary chapters in discussions of morality, family, and the perils of forbidden knowledge. Historians and storytellers alike emphasized the central question: to what extent is one responsible for the sins of one's ancestors, and how should knowledge of the past influence present choices? The plantation's physical decay mirrored the erosion of the social order that had once allowed such tragedies to occur. South Carolina's landscapes reclaimed the estate, vines overtook foundations, forests swallowed gardens, and the slave cemetery became indistinct under the growing brush. Yet the moral and emotional weight of the Lambert story refused to fade. Each overgrown path and collapsed wall became a silent testament to the human suffering that had unfolded there. Visitors who dared approach the ruins often reported feelings of unease. Some heard whispers carried on the wind, shadows flitted in peripheral vision, and sudden chills suggested unseen presences. These accounts, whether imagined or real, served as reminders that the consequences of hidden actions can endure long after the individuals involved have perished. The plantation, once a symbol of wealth and control, had transformed into a monument of warning. The sins of the past leave an indelible mark. The Lambert tragedy also became a lens through which to examine broader social reality. The intersections of slavery, abuse of power, forbidden desire, and generational secrecy created circumstances in which personal and familial disaster became inevitable. The narrative illustrated how oppressive systems compound private misfortune and how the moral failings of one generation can cascade across decades, producing suffering for those who had no part in the original action. The final lesson of the Lambert plantation is as stark as it is timeless. Some truths carry consequences beyond comprehension, and some actions, even those motivated by love, protection, or a desire for justice, can unleash irreversible tragedy. Estella's decision to reveal the secret, Craig's obsession with redemption, and Lena's desperate attempts to prevent further suffering intersected in a way that none could have controlled. The ruins, the whispered stories, and the haunted landscape stand as evidence of the fragility of human morality under extreme pressure. Today, the Lambert plantation exists only as stone foundations and scattered columns amid the reclaiming forest. Yet the story endures, a somber reflection on secrecy, guilt, and the human tendency to seek understanding or absolution at great cost. The ruins are silent, but those who walk the land cannot escape the echo of lives destroyed, of innocence corrupted, and of knowledge that proved too heavy to bear. The Lambert family's legacy is one of caution. It asks each generation to reflect on the boundaries of moral responsibility, the weight of secrets, and the dangers of pursuing forbidden knowledge. It reminds us that actions, even those intended to reveal truth or protect others, can cascade into consequences no one can foresee. And it shows that some tragedies are written not only in the events themselves, but in the land, the memory, and the whispers that persist long after the individuals are gone. The plantation, overgrown and abandoned, remains a silent monument to the perils of human secrecy and the echoes of forbidden desire. Its story is a warning and a testament. Even in the most respectable facades, darkness can thrive, and the cost of hidden truths can reverberate across generations. For those who study the Lambert tragedy, the question remains hauntingly clear. Which truths must remain buried, and what is the price of unearthing them? Decades passed, and the Lambert plantation, though overgrown and silent, refused to be forgotten. Local legends persisted, spoken in hushed tones around fires or at taverns, warning of the curse that seemed to linger over the land. Children dared each other to cross the broken stone pathways, while adults avoided the ruins after dark, claiming the air itself carried a weight of sorrow too heavy to bear. Historians and folklorists would later call it the curse of Lambert, though no single misfortune could fully explain it. Each new family who attempted to restore or occupy the estate reported inexplicable events, sudden illness among workers, tools disappearing, shadows that moved independently of their owners. Some claimed to hear soft cries carried on the wind, a mother's lament for a child lost before its time. Others swore they glimpsed fleeting figures near the burned foundations, as if the spirits of Craig and Lena still lingered, bound by their unfinished grief. In the decades after Estella's death, Mammy Eliza's story became part of the oral history. Her role as both witness and reluctant agent of revelation was remembered with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. Elders recounted her courage in facing decades of secrecy and her grief at seeing the consequences unfold. She had carried the weight of family sins and the burden of forbidden knowledge, and though she passed quietly in 1852, her presence was said to linger in the plantation's shadows, murmuring prayers for the souls she had watched perish. The Lambert plantation also served as a lens for examining the harsh realities of its time. The intersection of slavery, power, secrecy, and forbidden desire had created a situation in which tragedy was inevitable. Craig and Lena's story demonstrated how societal structures could magnify private misfortune, how abuse and unchecked authority could set the stage for devastation, and how generational secrets could explode with irreversible consequences. In local memory, the plantation became a symbol of caution. It reminded residents that the sins of one generation could ripple across decades, that attempts to rectify past wrongs could lead to further suffering, and that some truths were too dangerous to reveal. Families would speak of the Lambers quietly, their story a moral parable about secrecy, guilt, and the limits of human understanding. Archaeologists and historians who visited the site in the 20th century noted the enduring presence of the ruins, the encroaching vegetation, and the faint traces of human life preserved in foundations and scattered remnants. Though the story of Craig, Lena, and Estella was largely lost to formal records, the memory persisted in the landscape itself. The plantation became a place where the past could be felt as much as seen, a site where history, legend, and human tragedy converge. Even today, travelers report a distinct chill when passing the site, a sensation of being watched, and whispers that seem to have no source. Some claim to see shadows moving among the ruins at dusk, or hear faint sobbing carried on the wind. These reports serve as reminders that the consequences of forbidden knowledge and hidden sins can echo long after the individuals involved have passed. The Lambert story continues to provoke reflection. It asks enduring questions about morality, secrecy, and human responsibility. Are there truths that should never be revealed? To what extent are descendants responsible for the sins of their ancestors? And how does the pursuit of redemption, when taken to extremes, become its own form of destruction? The plantation itself, reclaimed by nature and obscured by history, stands as a silent witness. Its overgrown paths and collapsed walls are more than relics. They are monuments to the fragility of human life under oppressive systems, to the weight of hidden truths, and to the haunting power of past sin. The legacy of the Lambert family is not one of wealth or status, but of caution, a narrative of loss, obsession, and the tragic consequences of choices made under impossible circumstance. Ultimately, the story of Craig, Lena, and Estella reminds us that human actions, even those motivated by love or concern, can have devastating consequences when intertwined with secrecy, forbidden desire, and social injustice. The Lambert plantation is more than ruins. It is a moral landscape, a place where history teaches that some truths, once unearthed, cannot be contained, and that the echoes of tragedy can persist across generations, haunting not only the living, but the land itself. By the turn of the 20th century, the Lambert plantation had become a cautionary tale whispered across generations. Few dared approach the ruins after dark, and even during the day, visitors reported an oppressive heaviness in the air, as though the earth itself remembered the tragedies that had occurred. The whispers of the past seemed woven into the rustling of the trees, and the very wind carried the memory of sorrow, loss, and forbidden knowledge. Local families told stories of spectral figures wandering the property, sometimes a woman kneeling in the garden, hands in the dirt, murmuring incomprehensible prayers, sometimes a man pacing the pathways, muttering about sin and redemption. Some claimed to hear the distant cries of a child, echoing from the forgotten graves where the deformed infant had been laid. Those who spent the night near the ruins described vivid nightmares, strange apparitions, and a chilling sensation of being watched, as if the spirits of Craig, Lena, and the unborn child lingered to bear witness to the living. The plantation's dark reputation deterred would-be buyers for decades. Each new owner reported unexplained phenomena, fires igniting without cause, furniture displaced as if by unseen hands, and shadows that seemed to move independently of any living presence. Even workers experienced an inexplicable fear, refusing to remain after sunset, claiming the land itself was cursed. Scholars and journalists who investigated the property often left unsettled, their reports hinting at events that defied rational explanation. Despite the passage of time, the legacy of secrecy and forbidden knowledge continued to shape the land. Mammy Eliza's silence, the Lambert family's hidden sins, and the unspoken horrors of incest and abuse had left a residue, an invisible imprint that no natural disaster could erase. Even as the plantation changed hands repeatedly, the tragedy remained embedded in the ruins, influencing the fates of those who dared enter. The story of Craig and Lena became more than just a family tragedy. It became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, societal oppression, and hidden desires. It reminded the surrounding communities that the sins of one generation could cascade across time, manifesting in ways that were cruel, unpredictable, and devastating. The narrative served as a warning about the fragility of morality when secrecy, passion, and privilege intersect, and how the pursuit of redemption can transform into a destructive obsession. By the mid-20th century, the ruins of the Lambert main house had mostly collapsed, leaving only fragmented stone walls and overgrown foundations. The slave cemetery where Lena and her first child rested was nearly indistinguishable beneath vines and tall grass. Yet the land retained its aura of dread. Visitors spoke of sudden chills, whispering voices, and the feeling of eyes upon them. Hunters reported equipment failing inexplicably, and locals maintained a respectful distance, offering prayers or leaving small tokens to appease whatever spirits remained. In literary and historical circles, the Lambert plantation came to be cited as a prime example of how personal sin and societal injustice can merge into a multi-generational catastrophe. The intertwining of incest, abuse, and slavery created a scenario where moral failings and human frailty were magnified by circumstance. The tale remained unresolved, offering no easy lessons, no redemption for the living, only a stark reminder that some secrets are too dangerous to reveal, and some truths too heavy to bear. Even today, the story lingers. Tourists occasionally stumble upon the ruins, sensing the oppressive weight of the past. Paranormal enthusiasts visit with cameras and recording devices, hoping to capture proof of the Lambert curse. But whether real or imagined, the legacy endures, a testament to human weakness, the consequences of secrecy, and the haunting power of unspoken sins. The Lambert plantation, though now reclaimed by the South Carolina wilderness, remains a silent monument to tragedy. Its story challenges us to reflect on the cost of hidden knowledge, the dangers of obsessive morality, and the unrelenting impact of generational trauma. In every creaking floorboard, every shattered stone, and every whisper of wind through the ruins, the echoes of Craig, Lena, and Estella remind us that some legacies are impossible to bury, and that the past, no matter how deeply concealed, can reach out from the shadows to shape the present. The shadow of the Lambert family persists, a haunting reminder that human actions, secrets, and sins can reverberate far beyond their origin. Those who walk the land today are warned, whether consciously or not. Every whisper in the trees, every fleeting shadow carries the memory of forbidden love, obsession, and the inexorable consequences of truth revealed too late. The Lambert plantation, though abandoned and overgrown, continued to occupy a peculiar place in the collective consciousness of the surrounding region. Stories of the cursed estate circulated in hushed tones in local taverns, among farmers in the fields, and within nearby schools, often exaggerated with each retelling. The narrative of Craig and Lena became legend, a cautionary tale about the intertwining of power, secrecy, and forbidden desire, but also a somber meditation on human fragility and the consequences of moral transgression. In the decades following the fire of 1889, amateur historians and curious descendants of the Lambert family occasionally visited the property. They found only ruins, yet these remnants bore silent witness to the horrors once committed within the main house. Occasionally a visitor reported faint cries of a child, the scent of smoke without source, or the fleeting silhouette of a figure pacing the overgrown hallway. Such accounts reinforced the idea that the Lambert tragedy had left an indelible imprint, not merely on the land but on the ether of memory itself. By the early 20th century, the story of the Lambert family had transcended local folklore. Scholars of Southern history and culture began to cite it as an example of how slavery, patriarchal power, and secrecy could converge to create profound, multi-generational tragedy. They examined the psychological effects on the individuals involved, particularly Estella, who bore the crushing burden of forbidden knowledge, Craig, whose descent into obsession and guilt culminated in catastrophic violence, and Lena, whose innocence and suffering were annihilated by circumstances beyond her control. The plantation itself came to symbolize the ultimate consequences of hidden sins. It served as a metaphor for how systemic abuse and personal transgression could echo through generations, claiming lives, sanity, and the capacity for future happiness. The tragic intersection of incest, power, and secrecy demonstrated that even with the best intentions, the revelation of a truth too heavy to bear could catalyze devastation rather than justice. As the 20th century progressed, nature gradually reclaimed the land. Trees grew through the remnants of the mansion, vines snaked through collapsed walls, and the cemeteries of slaves and family members alike were swallowed by underbrush. Yet even as the physical traces of the Lambert family faded, the story persisted, carried in whispered warnings, local lore, and occasional sensationalized newspaper accounts. The plantation became a symbol of the persistent shadow of the past, a place where the weight of memory could be almost tangible. In recent years, amateur ghost hunters and paranormal researchers have attempted to document the estate's mystery. They report erratic electromagnetic readings, sudden temperature drops, and the sensation of being watched. Some claim to capture voices on recording devices, speaking indistinctly of guilt, redemption, and loss. Others experience intense emotional reactions, crying, nausea, or anxiety, without apparent cause. Whether these phenomena are the echoes of human imagination or residual energy left by the Lambert family, the plantation's reputation as a haunted place remains firmly entrenched. Despite the ruin and decay, the story of Craig, Lena, and Estella offers enduring lessons. It underscores the profound impact of secrets on human relationships, the dangers of obsessive morality, and the devastating consequences of attempting to resolve sins without understanding the full scope of the repercussions. The Lambert tragedy reminds us that some truths are so heavy that revealing them can destroy lives, and some sins are so entrenched that no one can fully escape their consequence. The ghosts of the Lambert plantation, whether literal or metaphorical, serve as a reminder that the past is never truly buried. It seeps into the present, shaping perceptions, guiding actions, and warning future generations of the peril inherent in unchecked power and hidden knowledge. Those who venture onto the grounds today often describe a profound sense of foreboding, a feeling that the land itself holds memory and judgment. In the end, the Lambert plantation stands as a monument, not only to the personal tragedies of a single family, but to the broader, more universal themes of human weakness, moral complexity, and the inescapable weight of history. Craig and Lena's story is preserved, not in the grandeur of a mansion, nor in the permanence of well-marked graves, but in the silence of ruins, the whispers in the trees, and the collective memory of a community scarred by tragedy. The tale poses uncomfortable questions. Are we ever truly responsible for the sins of our ancestors? Should all truths be revealed, or do some remain too dangerous to expose? And when secrets are finally unearthed, can humanity survive the knowledge, or does it demand a price too high to pay? The Lambert plantation may be overgrown and crumbling, but the story it shelters continues to haunt the imagination, a stark, enduring reminder that the choices of the past reverberate through time, and that some stories, no matter how deeply buried, refuse to remain silent.